So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session today on what is the green economy and what are green jobs. So delighted to introduce our colleague, Tom Perigo, Lead Officer for Industrial Strategy here at Hammersmith and Fulham Council, and other guest speakers as well, who Tom will introduce as we go. My name's Emily. I am Engagement Lead for Climate Emergency here at the Council. And just wanted to give a wee bit of context as to why we're here and some background. So on the next slide, you'll see that next week, many of us have probably seen on the news that we're gearing up for COP26, which is the UN Climate Change Conference. So world leaders are descending on Glasgow, and we'll be making some really big decisions about, our current contribution to climate change and how we radically cut carbon emissions to protect people and planet. And on the next slide, you'll see that, we know that these conversations with world leaders are going to be incredibly important. But whatever those decisions and those commitments that are made there, it's going to be the action that we take locally that's actually going to drive the change. And that's why we're running this whole weekend program of events and activities in lead up to this. And this is all about education and awareness, but also showing good practice and good work that's already happening across the borough. So please do have a look at the website and have a look at the program. This week we've got 50 things that are on. So a program tomorrow, all about adapting to climate change, and a fab day on Saturday throughout the borough in parks and in Lyric Square around ecology. And just on the next slide, you will see that we have recently published our climate and ecology strategy, which sets out the route to net zero emissions by 2030. So we have declared that we will reduce carbon emissions to net zero, not just for the council's activities, but for the wider borough. And that includes residents, visitors, and organisations. We have what we call 5 climate challenges that we need to tackle, which includes eliminating the carbon emissions from our homes and buildings, from the way that we travel and move around, and from the things that we buy and use, including food. We've also set out a plan of how we plan to protect people and nature by making more space for nature and enhancing biodiversity in the borough, but also preparing for climate change, adapting to the changes that are underway, and making communities resilient. But today's session, and really the theme of today, is all about the green economy and, grasping the opportunities that are going to come from this transition away from fossil fuels to more sustainable ways of living and working is one of the key opportunities that we've got here. And today we'll really hear, what does a green economy mean in practice, and what are green jobs as well? So that's all from me. I'm now going to hand over to my colleague, Tom, who will start the session. Thanks, Tom. Tom, just need to check that you can unmute yourself there. Fab.
There we are. Right. So let me just get back to the slide 1 second. Thank you very much, Emily. And I think it's worth saying what a brilliant job you've done of putting on all these events this week to kind of engage people around all of the issues around the climate emergency. So I think it's worth saying Hammersmith and Fulham was one of the first councils to declare a climate emergency and set an ambitious goal of achieving net zero locally by 2030. In 2017, Hammersmith and Fulham also launched our ambitious industrial strategy. And I think in many ways, the industrial strategy is a departure from the kind of pure market and laissez-faire approaches to economics that we've seen in the past. Industrial strategy is really about active economics focused around democratic objectives and goals, and not just growth for growth's sake. So the industrial strategy has also been anchored by a really important partnership with Imperial College, who've been instrumental in developing activity around our innovation district at White City. In the context of our climate emergency and our industrial strategy objectives of inclusion, we're going to explore today what green economy is, if or which parts of it might be growing, and how it can contribute to addressing climate emergency issues and our net zero 2030 goal. So today we hope to show you some really interesting and useful examples of local activity, because there really are. So whether you're a local resident wondering what the green economy can offer, or indeed what you could offer it, whether you already work in the field, or if you're considering what to study, there should be something for you today. I'm also joined by 3 people involved in producing some very new and clever insights around the green economy, and some data that will help us sort of frame how we define it. So they are James Edgar, who's the Chief Economist at WPI Economics, Matt Williams, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Employment Studies, and Jack Lewis, who's a data scientist based at the Data City. So all of them have been involved in producing some of the sort of insights that we'll be sharing today. And these new insights can sort of tell us who our green economy companies are, if they're growing and hiring, and we can also look at some of the real jobs that are kind of live at the moment in the borough and what the sort of skills requirements for those are. So I was going to get James Edgar from WPI Economics to just introduce us briefly to these 11 sectors that you can see on the screen, and perhaps help tell us a little about why these definitions of green economy activity are important.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks all. So yes, so this is some research that we have been doing across London, and the first question that we were asked was, how do you define green jobs and the green economy? And our recommendation and focus, what we've said is that those terms don't exist in isolation of policy. We have them because of what we need to do. We need to achieve net zero and broader environmental goals, and that's why we're interested in the sector. So very practical definition that's focused on the jobs which help us deliver what we need to do. In order to try and categorize and understand them, these sectors here are what we've come up with reviewing recent reports for Green Jobs Task Force from central government, and then the Mayor of London's London Environmental Strategy and London Council's London Environment Directors Network Statement on Climate Change that split, that look at the policy areas that need to be included. From a London, particularly from a London perspective, we've added in here green finance and then the research development and climate change strategy space, because all of that is activity which is London has specialisation in, and then reducing localised pollution as well from broader environmental goals, because of the importance of air quality here as well.
Brilliant, thank you, James. And I think that's a really important point about these not existing in isolation from policy. So I'll move on to a sort of brief historical tour of the green economy in London from the year 1901, which I think is when one of the first companies was registered. Now you can see the dates ticking by on the top left corner. There's very little activity until towards the end of the 20th century, when we can see a bit of a spike in activity. The height of some of those bars represent the number of employees. We can see some very large companies emerging towards the end of the 20th century. And I think this data really picks up on sort of private sector company growth in what we're defining as the green economy now in London. So we can see that the end of the 20th century was a period where there's a lot of activity, and some of these larger companies are also publicly limited companies that are traded on the stock market that you can see in those tan bars there. So I think that is a sort of important point we'll come back to later. I think that the little green square in the middle of Hyde Park is quite interesting there. It shows you that that's probably the groundskeeping company for the Royal Parks based there. So going on to an overview in 2021, we can see this overview of green employment across London. This highlights some of the more sort of significant concentrations of employment. And there's a clear cluster around the city and Camden and Islington, with Barking and Dagenham also having an interestingly sort of high total. So I know that actually some of this data is from 2017, and I think that there might be a possibility for some new data that's going to update some of this that's also coming out shortly, which James might talk about. So In London, there are 3,660 companies, and they're employing just under 130,000 people. Hammersmith and Fulham, we can see, starts from a slightly lower total, not having some of those sort of larger clusters that the centre of London has. So that's a sort of interesting picture to start from. Ooh. We think, in terms of the sort of higher proportions of jobs in some boroughs, that Barking Dagenham in East London has repurposed some of their traditional power sector into being sort of directed towards community heat networks, which are part of the green economy. And the City of London, we think that green finance jobs are the driver of the sort of cluster in this sector. And that's obviously relates to the city being the location of some of those publicly traded green economy companies as well. I think Richmond's interesting. We weren't sure what was driving that kind of cluster in Richmond, but we might come back to that later at the end. So, zooming in on Hammersmith and Fulham, we can see that we've started from a low base, so to speak, but are growing very, very fast. So since 2015, the number of companies that are active in the borough, many of which will be small startup companies who are moving into this space, has tripled. And the local demand for green skills in those businesses has risen by a factor of 10. So I think that's a really significant thing to pick up on, that it might be a very, very small total, but actually this is growing very, very fast, and it doesn't even capture the last 2 years. So we might expect to see a sort of similar rise over that period. Lots of companies in Hammersmith have 0 employees in the sector, but in lots of cases, lots of those companies will have multiple directors that are also involved in the kind of pre-commercial setup and are still active. So just because a company has nil employees doesn't mean that there's sort of nobody working on that sort of agenda. And I think our next slide, we're going to look at where the green economy has sprouted some shoots in the borough, and who 1 or 2 of the key companies are in this space. So another time-lapse animation briefly, starting in 1998 this time, and the green economy in Hammersmith and Fulham is much more recent and younger even than across London. So this also captures businesses with 0 employees, which the previous London map didn't. Again, there's very little activity at first, some much more recent spikes in both micro business formation and some larger employers popping up roughly after this sort of 2012, 13, 14, 15 time period. And I think it's also really interesting that earlier incarnations or at the beginning of this period of the emergence of the green economy in Hammersmith, moving to the next part of the animation, the purple blocks, which you can see there, don't have net zero attached to them as a kind of mission goal in their description. So it suggests that policy mission of net zero is actually really significant. Some of these companies that have formed are quite significant, and Arrival have only sprung up in 2015. They're a breakthrough electric vehicles business. Much like Tesla, their vehicles are sort of high-performing electric vehicles, but they're specifically targeted with Arrival at commercial markets, and they make vans and buses rather than private leisure vehicles. Phoenix Renewables are primarily active in the sort of construction, engineering and retrofit sector, but also active across the UK. So they've got locations in Leeds and Edinburgh. And Alpha Energy, who are one of the earlier companies in the borough, formed in 2003, provide energy consultancy advice to sort of global clients in the business sector. So I've highlighted these 3 because all of them are hiring, and we'll come back onto this in a moment. So looking at green occupations, the skills that are demanded overall across London, which is the all employed bar, we can see that comparing the green economy sector to this, there are lots more jobs that are associated with sort of professional and technical skills, and that's about 50% higher than the London average. Managers and directors are also about 50% higher than the London average, and that suggests many newly sort of smaller newly formed smaller startup businesses that are beginning to operate in the sector. I think the thing to really point out is that craft skills are really the sort of stand out, with sort of demand about 300% higher than in the green economy, than in the economy across London overall. So that encompasses lots of roles that we'd call sort of skilled trades, and in lots of cases can imply quite labour intensive and artisanal skills. So on the right of the graphic, we can see 4 green economy sectors and how they demand slightly different balances of those skills. So things like power and consultancy finance sectors have very strong demand for professional and associate professional technical skills. But in the home retrofit and reduce, reuse, recycle sector, we can really see those sort of skilled crafts, which would be to do with, sort of bespoke retrofit skills that people have in that sector. So looking at some of the actual jobs, you may recognise Alpha Energy and Phoenix Works here, who I mentioned were hiring. So these are some of the jobs that are actually being advertised right now in Hammersmith and Fulham. I think it's really useful to sort of illustrate the sort of similarities and differences between some of these jobs. So Phoenix Works have more sort of installation of electric vehicle charging points, and sort of installing solar PV on roofs type roles. Human Forest have kind of mix of roles where they've got mechanic and field operations roles, but also some quite sort of professional technical roles like data analyst and growth marketing specialists. Alpha Energy, on the other hand, are almost exclusively kind of professional client management roles. So what has this told us? I wonder if Matt would have anything to chip in on this, because I've also referred to some of his parts of the research here.
Thanks, Tom. Just to say, there is perhaps a misleading perception that green skills is all around people installing air source heat pumps and things like that. But the analysis here shows that across a wide range of sectors around the consultancy and power side, there are a lot of roles in those professional, associate professional type occupations. And so there are, a wide range of skill needs within the sector, and a wide range of opportunities for employment for those outside green sectors to be able to move in to these roles as the sector scales up over the next 10 to 30 years to meet net zero targets.
And I know that one of the things that the research picked up on, Matt, was that actually the green sector quite often tends to hire people directly from employment rather than directly from education. So do you think that implies that a lot of skills that the green sector needs to use are also partly transferable skills that people can develop in other sectors?
Yeah, very much so. I think, again, there's there are slightly different sort of sectors which feed into the green sectors we've identified, although manufacturing is a common source of labour for all the sectors we've identified. But yeah, on the consultancy finance and on the power side, they tend to be drawing in staff from IT sector, retail sector, advertising and market research sectors. So people with like business, finance, marketing skills developed in other sectors, but then transitioning across into green sectors.
That's really interesting, and I think it possibly sort of speaks to a role that the council can play on some level in helping people develop these kinds of vocational skills and sort of work experience that the green sector, the green economy seems to sort of place a higher demand on having a qualification and that experience compared to those overall London sectors. So I'll move on to briefly how one of the sort of approaches that is being developed locally to help support those kinds of skills to be developed. So I couldn't very well do this presentation without mentioning the West London College Green Skills Academy. Now, they are currently waiting for a decision on this, so fingers crossed. But if successful, it will build on their successful construction academy hub model, which has been pioneered by the GLA. In this case, obviously, they will direct the training specifically at green skills, but there are, in many cases, quite a lot of crossovers into construction skills. So this graphic also shows some of the spaces they're going to be focusing on, and we can see with things like that retrofit and efficiency, low carbon transport, and the circular economy sector, that also sort of relates to the jobs that we're seeing advertised as well. So that's very, very sort of well targeted. Now, moving on, some people talk about gazelles and cheetahs in the growth lingo, which can refer to tech growth companies. In Hammersmith, we're looking for green unicorns, and what better setting than Climate Week to announce that we're going on a green unicorn hunt in Hammersmith. So just to clarify, unicorn startups are actually companies which have reached a valuation of around 1 billion. So what we're looking for is really that kind of successful growth startup green company in the borough. And we didn't have to look very far before finding Arrival Electric Vehicles, who I'd mentioned on the time-lapse slide. So they were actually formed in 2015 and make vans and buses, but in 2020 they were valued at £1 billion, technically making them a green unicorn briefly. So unfortunately, they've since been acquired by an investment vehicle in the United States, and our single green unicorn has been sort of poached by international finance to some extent. However, they are still based down the road near Earl's Court and are hiring, advertising a huge number of roles in London. So here are some of the roles that Arrival have advertised in London. I actually couldn't fit them all on one slide. So we've got things like I think product lifecycle management is what PLM stands for. Creative technologists, design engineers, electricians and mechanical technicians, Python engineers, which is a sort of coding software, legal counsels, and also procurement specialists. So there's really a huge range of roles there. And I wonder if I think some of these high growth and tech-based companies will quite often have demand for a sort of large range and types of skills when they are growing. So looking at some of the other sectors that or other companies that might be emerging into this kind of growth space, the Climate Innovation Accelerator, the Climate Kick based at Imperial College, has actually helped support a number of emerging companies that are located up in White City. So the project is linked to the EIT, the European Institute of Innovation and Technology. And some of these companies are doing really incredible things, which I think are worth a sort of brief closer look. Arboria produce things called bio-solar leaves. They facilitate growth of microscopic plants that produce food ingredients and sort of nutrition, but also generate breathable oxygen and sequester huge amounts of carbon dioxide. So they work like solar panels, but rather than producing energy, produce oxygen and food. Pure Affinity have developed a brilliant solution to PFAS pollution in water and soil. So for anybody who doesn't know what that is, PFAS compounds, sometimes called fluorosurfactants, have also come up against heavy regulations in the EU and US, and so there's much stricter regulations on how much of them are tolerated in our soil and water. So now that they're there, Pure Affinity have actually produced a product which can help reduce those concentrations, and probably expect that they will see huge demand for that product. Maltus Media are a very interesting company. They say on their website that cultivated meat is the food of the future. With their new meat product, they will not have to slaughter any animals to meet our demand for protein. Essentially, they grow meat in a what they call a media, which doesn't require antibiotics. It's grown in a sterile environment, but they say this can reduce the greenhouse gas emissions associated with meat production by 87%. So that is absolutely huge. Another company that aren't on this map, Polymateria, have invented a new kind of biodegradable plastic, which could be used for all types of plastic packaging. They've been awarded technology pioneer status by the World Economic Forum this year, which is also a hugely impressive achievement. And I was told this morning at one of our events that actually this cluster around Imperial College, as well as generating a lot of innovation investment, which I've mentioned here, so there's about 2 million in 2020-21 that's gone into green innovation there. It's also generated about £500 million worth of private investment, which I want to check, but it's a hugely significant amount. So these companies that are starting up here are also going global quite quickly as a result of the support that Imperial College and this innovation cluster gives them. So looking at some of the innovation companies in Hammersmith on this slide, and this is slightly different to the green economy companies who have already started up and commercialized. This shows around £55 worth of Innovate UK investment across different sectors since 2004. So they've got about 204 projects in Hammersmith and Fulham. Since 2017 and the formation of our industrial strategy partnership with Imperial College, around £8.7 million has been invested by Innovate UK in net zero and climate relevant innovations, which I can show some on screen here. So we can see that sort of step change, and to a great extent it's been sort of catalysed by the mission relevant innovations that are going on around our innovation district. So some of these include H2Go Power, who've recently raised about £500,000 in investment. They provide zero emission solid state hydrogen storage and hydrogen artificial intelligence solutions. They're also part of a wider national initiative called Fly to Plan, which aims to provide a platform for low carbon and unmanned drone flights. So their hydrogen capture technology can extend the range of battery powered electric flights and drone flights, which could be involved in things like delivering medicines or emergency provisions, or getting access to sort of looking at dangerous environments, etc., that you wouldn't want to send humans into. Adionics are a very interesting company. They use 3D structures to improve the energy density of batteries, designing next generation lithium ion battery technology. So that has a number of applications for phones, laptops, medical devices, electric flight and electric ground vehicles, and will improve the efficiency of energy use and storage across all of those. Finally, RFC Power are a very interesting company, and they're sort of looking at driving down the cost of storing energy in batteries, and have a very complicated project description of what their Redux Flow project actually is. Lastly, Orca Computing are really, really interesting and trying to decarbonize or reduce the carbon impact of training an AI platform. So one of the other huge growth sectors across London is sort of AI and big data economy. But right at the minute, training an AI emits the equivalent carbon to 5 cars over a year. So I think as that sector grows, this kind of service will be really important in helping lower costs for companies trying to move into that sector, and also decarbonising it at the same time as all these other companies are helping produce power and energy solutions that will allow AI to perhaps become a bit more sustainable in the future. So we've got a real innovation specialism in the green economy, and a lot of that relates to some significant national strategic missions, which I think are really useful to sort of bring up. Things like the National Battery Challenge, generating clean hydrogen, decarbonising AI as a growth sector, and the future of flight and sort of what, you know, Heathrow Airport's sort of emissions load that it might have to do something about in the very near future, we think. So when we think about the sort of Innovate UK investment and how it translates into value, we also need to look at markets and what their sort of readiness is to actually invest in some of these ideas. So I rather like this graph because it's actually quite optimistic from the London Stock Exchange. It shows that over the past 5-6 years, the willingness of the market is more than tripled in terms of its willingness to invest in green technologies. This is very good news for, illustrating the fact that things like pension funds are switching away and from fossil fuel and carbon intensive markets. So I think that's really important to take note of, because obviously it scales up by a huge factor what the sort of Innovate UK investments start. So I want to use this slide to illustrate a point moving towards the end of the presentation, because I also think that the market will not do all of the work for us. I think it's absolutely brilliant to see Hammersmith and Fulham scoring so highly on the Civic Participation Index, which has just been published. And I think in terms of how we think about sort of green economics, it's really important to sort of understand that some of the sort of carbon problems with climate change are driven by market failure, but also by a failure of collective action. We don't know who should step up and exactly what their incentives are to do so. But I think it's very much all of our jobs to step up at the moment. We all have an incentive to do so. And I very much hope that that's what an inclusive and green industrial strategy can mean. That we act collectively, not in isolation. We have an active and democratic conversation about how to identify, crowdsource, and even crowdfund local missions that can help achieve net zero. I think a brilliant example of a local community-focused green economy business that has sort of inclusion at its heart is Bikeworks. So their ride side-by-side service, which is pictured as an assisted mobility service designed to support people who would not be confident in cycling unassisted. So it's particularly for older people, those with disabilities, people with dementia use it. They even have a bicycle capable of carrying a wheelchair on the side of it. So that means that members of the community who would otherwise be less likely to take part can experience the benefits of cycling, get outdoors, be more active, and also in that sense be part of what we mean by the green economy. And have all the mental health benefits and physical benefits that come with that, also exploring our wonderful borough safely. So I think what a brilliant local scheme. Dr. Bike has also been out as part of Climate Week, offering free bike services. So some of you who've been out and about in the borough may have seen them there as well. Lastly, to mention, Bikeworks also provide sort of training on bike mechanics, sort of level 1 courses, and also offer a new electric vehicle repair and maintenance course. They are also, I believe, hiring for somebody to be a bike mechanic and also a cycle instructor, although I think that role is in East London. So brilliant routes to, be able to take part in and be included in the green economy from a range of sources. Just finally, in terms of the Hammersmith and Fulham industrial strategy and how it can support the green economy activity moving forwards, support the growth that we can see springing up in the borough, I think the principle of inclusion and a just transition run through both the industrial strategy and climate emergency responses that Hammersmith and Fulham have developed. So I've mentioned lots of sort of commercial activity and business activity, and businesses will also tend to operate with commercial concerns. But I think when we think about the sort of future innovation pipeline, what we choose to invent, which ideas are prioritised to receive public funding that then leads on to the private funding, we do have a real ability to shape this, to co-produce it and influence it through public discourse, by bringing together communities of practice, by supporting community-led green economy ideas, supporting the development of skills, beginning with climate education schools, which Hammersmith and Fulham delivers a lot of, and also training future entrepreneurs to radically innovate new and as yet unthought of climate solutions. So I will conclude there and hand over to Emily. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you also to all of our speakers as well. I have so many questions. Amazing to see the breadth of things that are already happening across the borough. But I will also give other people the chance to ask their questions as well. I'm going to pause the recording there. Thanks for that, everyone. So finally, just before we wrap up, what is on today? If you have a look at the programme, which is on lbhf.gov.uk/climate-carnival, you can have a look at some of the events that are happening today. We've usually got a couple of webinars in the afternoon and lots of events happening out and about all over the borough. So please do have a look. We've got over 50 things happening this week. So please do check out the programme and get involved if you have time later today. And finally, just before we wrap up, please do sign up to our newsletter. So this is a monthly newsletter all about climate action taking place across the borough. We talk about what we're doing as a council, things that are happening in the community, things you can get involved in, as well as what we're reading and sharing. So if you head to the climate pages on our website, you can sign up for Climate Connects. And finally, that's us for this morning. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming along, to all of our speakers for presenting and for everyone's questions and comments. That's our generic email address there that comes through to me. So look forward to speaking with you there, and our web address as well. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of the week.